everyone. I'm Caitlin Farrell. I'm a TAMS Track 1 student, and I'm going to be introducing our first lecture speaker of the year, Dr. Mareike Kleine. She's an assistant professor at the London School of Economics in the European Institute. The European Institute at the London School of Economics was founded in 1991, and it was formed to better understand the causes and processes of integration in the European Union, and it focuses on EU laws, policy, identity, and ideas of political economy. And the European Institute boasts that it has some of the broadest research scope and focus on political and economic issues in the EU, and it remains unrivaled in academia. Last year, Dr. Kleine was a guest professor at the Ninde de Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. She finished her PhD at Freie Universität in Berlin in 2009. And if she weren't working in academia, Dr. Kleine says that she would be the creative director for The Muppet Show. But alas, instead she's working on a book about informal governance, which in her dissertation she defines informal governance as uncodified rules of behavior running parallel to formal treaty rules in institutions in the European Union. Now, you might ask, what would compel one to want to write a book about informal governance in the European Union? Well, Dr. Kleine says that she saw a need to further explore the role of informal governance and was frustrated that theories of international cooperation and institutional design fell short of what some of the important, more formal institutions of the EU were looking for. Now, many times she told me that she was told her dissertation topic was too risky and that it wouldn't work, but she had persistence, she continued to pursue it, and with the encouragement of her advisors, Dr. Kleine's thesis on this topic was awarded Best Dissertation Award from the American Political Science Association in 2009. She says the most challenging part of her research is finding the data she needs to tell a convincing story. So when Dr. Kleine is not wrapped up with research, she said that she enjoys reading, sailing, swimming, and listening to music, going for walks, and watching good movies. Today, Dr. Kleine's lecture is called EU Governance in Times of Crisis, The Role of Informality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kleine to UNC.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Caitlin, for the flattering introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to finally be here. I did my undergrad at the Freie Universität Berlin, which is also taking part in the Transatlantic Masters. And I heard so many times the word Chapel Hill. I was wondering, what is Chapel Hill? It must be just a great idyllic place on a hill where people just reflect about the European Union. And now I'm finally here. It's great to finally be here and to meet you all here. So a little background to the book. So this book, as Caitlin said, it's based on my dissertation. It's finally, fortunately, coming out with Cornell University Press next year in 2013. So you're all encouraged to buy the book. It's going to be the seminal work on the European Union. And I started it before the Euro crisis. And the Euro crisis does not really feature prominently in the book itself, among other things, because there's simply little information available about what's actually happening behind the scenes currently during the Euro crisis, which is exactly my topic. But still, I think that my work can shed some light on what is actually going on during the Euro crisis. I'm right now writing a piece about it, or planning to write a piece about it. And so your feedback is very much appreciated. You can tell me what you think, to what extent you think it applies to the Euro crisis, and I will talk at the end of the talk a little bit also about it. So I learned that perhaps not everybody has the same background about the European Union. I'm not quite sure if that's correct, but I thought I'd just tell you a little bit how I think about the European Union to give you a little bit background. So the EU supposedly is very complicated, but in my opinion it can be stripped down just to very few basics. It's actually pretty simple. Compared to an international organization, there are a couple of commonalities. So the European Union, as other international organizations, it's treaty-based. It's a treaty-based cooperation. among 27 sovereign member states. In addition, there's no monopoly of violence, really. So there's no police, there's no European army. It's voluntary cooperation from every single of the European member states, despite the strong legal system. There are several differences, though, between the European Union and other international organizations. So the objective of the European Union is far more ambitious than what you have in the WTO, in the IMF, etc., etc. The objective of the European Union is to create a single market, a market where trading among countries is just as easy as trading within countries. So basically, the market should at one point look like the US internal market, or maybe even a little bit more integrated than the US market. This also means that the EU is not solely based on codified treaty. It has a legislative process that actually creates a couple of laws that are supposed to integrate the market even further. And so at the core of the European Union is a legislative process, as you would see it in the American political system, with an agenda setter, with people, with the parliament, etc., etc. These institutions, that's the conventional wisdom, have served to develop the European Union into the most economically integrated area in the whole world and the most successful international organization to date. So to give you a couple of figures, there are no single internal tariffs within the European Union. As of today, there's a single currency. We know that might not hold true in a couple of months, but still, it is unprecedented, or almost unprecedented in history. It accounts for more than 40% of the world trade. That is excluding intra-European trade. So the European Union is the world's, for every country, the world's most important trading partner. The level of price integration is comparable to that of the US. So that means what you pay for a soda in Germany is almost comparable to what you pay for a soda in, let's say, Portugal. How is this possible? If you look at your textbooks and ask for the conventional wisdom, then people will tell you, well, the European Union is just much more formally integrated than any other international organization. It has far more intrusive, supranational institutions. And those institutions at the core of the European Union, this is the community method, the legislative process in which the laws that integrate the European Union are made day to day. So let's have a look. We have the Commission, a supranational actor, which sets the agenda. It has the exclusive monopoly of initiative, which means if the European Commission does not propose legislation, nothing happens. The Council, which is comprised of the governments, then decides today jointly with the European Parliament upon these proposals. It decides with a qualified majority vote, and it can only change the Commission proposal if it is able to attain unanimity. So this means that it is far easier to simply adopt what the Commission presents as a proposal for legislation than to change it. And finally, these laws are ultimately adopted or implemented by the European Commission, but also other agencies and national administrations. So why would this legislative procedure be important for the economic integration? Well, you see, the delegation of authority to the European Commission, for instance, or even the European Parliament, is a commitment to European integration. So at every single stage of this procedure, it is possible for the majority of member states to actually impose something on a single or even a number of member states in the minority. So it is possible with this formal framework to go beyond the lowest common denominator and actually to move European integration forward. So it sounds very plausible that this formal structure actually can account for the deep level of integration in Europe and for why the European Union is so much more advanced than other international organizations where we have less delegation of authority and less pooling of sovereignty. Except that this is simply not the way how the European Union works. So if you look at the stage of agenda setter, the treaties say the Commission is the exclusive agenda setter. It also has the monopoly, supposedly, of expertise, and therefore it should actually propose the laws. We also hear that the Council should vote by qualified majority voting. And we hear from the treaty the Commission implements these decisions. But what you see instead is that the European Council, so the heads of state and government, have developed outside of the treaties as the principal agenda setter. They actually say what the Commission should propose. The Council presidency, which rotates on a 6-monthly basis among the member states, then refines these priorities. Also, the Commission does not really have the monopoly of expertise. The Commission is heavily dependent on governmental expertise and always consults national governments. In terms of voting, we see that the Council never really votes by qualified majority voting. If you look at the records, they always seek to find a consensus, always to integrate even those most recalcitrant countries in a final vote. Actually, votes are never recorded. It's just consensus that takes place in the Council. We see that the ministers themselves, they do not really prepare these decisions themselves. It's working groups and the COREPER, the Committee of Permanent Representatives, so national officials, who actually prepare these decisions and change or make amendments to the Commission proposal. And again, we see the Presidency mediating these compromises among the governments. And finally, it is not necessarily the Commission that implements these decisions, or the Commission does not really have too much discretion. We see a web of informal committees, the so-called comitology, that actually narrows the discretion and monitors the implementation by the Commission very, very closely. So instead of what I showed you before, this legislative procedure with the Commission setting the agenda, with the Council voting on legislative proposals, and with the Commission finally implementing the EU laws, it rather looks a little bit like this. It's there's a stage of pre-agenda setting where the European Council and the Presidency actually decide the guidelines of the European Union. We see that the Commission then consults national expert groups of what should be the content of these proposals, and we see that the whole decision-making process is surrounded just by informal practices, informal actors, usually national officials that try to mediate a consensus, and finally the Commission only implements very, very few laws, and when it implements laws, then it is closely monitored by the so-called comitology. I will have to make a couple of breaks because, as you might hear, I'm developing a cold. But if you can't understand me, just say something, raise your hand. So, how can we make sense of this? How can we explain these practices of informal governance, which are informal practices that not only run in parallel, but seemingly even contradict the purpose of the formal rules? Well, to foreshadow my argument briefly, I'm arguing that informal governance emerges out of a process of functional adaptation. The function of informal governance is to add flexibility to the formal rules. And this flexibility serves to resolve conflicts at the domestic level in a way that the formal rules are not really able to. And these are usually conflicts at the domestic level that are so excessive that they might disrupt the functioning of the European Union as a whole. So substantively, this means that formal and informal rules, they complement each other. It is in conjunction that they help attain and sustain a level of cooperation in a way that neither formal rules nor informal rules alone would actually permit. This has important implications, as I will tell you at the end of the talk, how the EU works in general, but also in times of crisis like the Euro crisis, has implications for who has power in the European Union, and also what is the source and a possible solution to the democratic deficit. So this is, in brief, the structure of my talk. I will briefly explain the theory to you, then explain the empirical strategy and show you some evidence that I present in my book in length. I will talk about informal governance and the Euro crisis in conjunction with the positive and the normative implication of this research. So why is there demand for flexibility? And in this regard, I'm just referring to the literature in political economy and international political economy on rules versus discretion or flexibility, the design of escape clauses, etc., etc. So recall that the formal legislative procedure is a commitment of the member states to integration. They accept being outvoted on individual issues in order to actually attain cooperation in the long run. What do commitments do? They manage expectations. So knowing that in the future everybody is going to cooperate and made a commitment to cooperate makes it easier for me to actually also commit to cooperation and accept being outvoted on individual issues or having things imposed on me. So it's knowing that everybody will stick to the rules that actually helps you cooperate. The problem, however, is that formal rules like this are designed under conditions of uncertainty. So situations are bound to arise, like for now, for instance, the Euro crisis, that were not expected and that may shake the equilibrium, right? So situations might arise where suddenly departing from the formal rules is much better, helps sustain the institution as such than actually sticking to the formal rules. And in the EU, these shocks, as you can call it, happen at the domestic level. So what can happen in the European Union is that adopting certain laws with the quite rigid formal procedures may actually lead to a redistribution of the costs and benefits at the domestic level in one or more member states that is so massive that actually there's domestic recalcitrance, domestic mobilization against EU as such that actually tempts governments not to comply with the laws. To give you a little example, because this sounds a little bit abstract, there's one episode that I'm describing in the chapter. I'm not quite sure if it was sent around. It's my favorite example, actually, because it takes place in the region where I grew up, in Hesse, and it's about Appleboy. So in, I think it was 2006, 2007, the European Commission was supposed to propose a new regulation for wine. And in this new regulation of wine, you had to define actually what wine is. And the northern member states, not being wine producers, they said, well, you know, we want a broad, consumer-friendly definition of wine that actually allows all kinds of, you know, producers to actually market it. Then there were southern countries that were threatened by the wine that is coming from the New World, as they call it, so from California, but also New Zealand, and they wanted a very, very narrow definition of wine that would protect them from what they suggested was bad wine from California. And so the European Commission submitted a legislative proposal which defined wine as, I think it was, an alcoholic beverage harvested from grapes, which sounds sort of pretty straightforward to you, but not to the producers of the so-called apple wine in Germany, in the state of Hesse. So apple wine, or is a cider-like drink. It's also called Stöpfsche, Äppler, Appleboy. They suddenly thought they were threatened they suddenly thought they would have to rename their product, and were absolutely afraid that they would lose recognition value and the market share. And so, unfortunately, this all took place during a very important election in the state of Hesse, which was also very important for the composition of the federal council in Germany. And so this became a major disaster. There were rallies, demonstrations against the European Union, and there were, I'm not kidding you, even threats to pull the state of Hesse out of the European Union. So this is an example for a domestic shock, right? For a case where actually adopting a European or an EU law that is supposed to integrate the European Union economically can have massive redistributive effects at the domestic level that actually change the politics of collective action in the at the domestic level, gives people an incentive to mobilize against the European Union and pressure the government into non-compliance with the treaty. So why is this problematic? It's not only problematic for the apple wine producers in the state of Hesse, it is problematic actually for all states, all member states at once. So recall that commitments work by managing stable expectations, right? But the moment that these expectations are disrupted, when one or more member states suddenly start not to comply, not to follow the rules, then this is bad news for all governments at once, because it means that they won't be able to sustain the deep level of cooperation that the formal rules actually allow them. So everyone is actually better off in this situation where a government really has an incentive to cave into narrow interests and not comply with the treaties, actually to accommodate this government in order to keep the expectations stable. So how do they do this? How do they add this kind of flexibility to the formal rules? I argue that this demand for flexibility gives rise to a norm of discretion that states that governments under strong pressure to defect should be really accommodated. And it manifests itself in informal governance, that is, governments collectively departing from the formal rules in order to exercise discretion, to bring in a government under pressure out from the cold into a consensus. So for instance, in a gender setting, you need somebody to predetermine the agenda. In voting, you need to refrain from majority voting and actually form a consensus. And the result is the web of informal governance practices that I showed you before that simply surrounds the formal rules in order to sort of mitigate these domestic shocks that these formal rules could create suddenly at the domestic level. So why is this informal? Pretty simply because these situations are political in nature. And they are also too complex simply to anticipate and too ambiguous to codify. So also codifying these rules, saying, for instance, well, when the interest group are really, really powerful, then it is okay not to vote. This just doesn't work. This contradicts the rules. You cannot really put this into writing. But it is also not that simple, because knowing that there's the possibility to be accommodated when you actually just complain loud enough, then this creates moral hazard. So if I know that, if I just complain loudly enough, others will actually make concessions to me, I have an incentive to exaggerate the pressure that I'm under. So simply departing from the formal rules, informal governance, might actually undermine the formal rules, the commitment, right? So how is it possible actually to have them complement each other? And I'm arguing that therefore you need an adjudicating government, a government that gathers information about what the domestic situation actually is and tries to figure out under whether or not a demand, a claim for informal governance is legitimate or is illegitimate. And so in combination with an adjudicating government that actually elicits information, you have informal governance and formal rules complement each other to actually attain and sustain a level of integration that neither the formal rules alone nor informal rules would actually permit you. Are there questions so far? Okay, so if you ask government officials or every actor actually in the European Union, they would tell you, yeah, it's kind of what is going on in the European Union. Whenever somebody has a real problem at home with implementing or even explaining a European Union law, then we try to find a consensus. But how can we actually explain it, and how can we test that this is going on? And so this is how I proceeded. The theory, which I call liberal regime theory, because it really combines interstate regime theory with domestic politics approaches. It has two testable implications. So the first testable implication is that informal governance, so the manifestation of the informal norm of discretion, it should vary across issue areas. So where there are shocks, like the one I described with the Appleboy example, where there's a propensity for such shocks, we should see informal governance. And where there's no such propensity, we should actually see actors sticking far more to the formal rules. Luckily, there's one issue area in the European Union that actually allows us to put the theory to a test, which is the common agricultural policy. The common agricultural policy subsidizes subsidizes farmers, European farmers. So it is deliberately designed to protect farmers from exogenous shocks. So it stabilizes also the level of mobilization of these farmers. And so everywhere else in the European Union, domestic interest groups or domestic actors are subject to shocks due to the economic, to the common single market. In the common agricultural policy, however, they are not subjected to any such shocks. So this is an area where we would not have the need for informal governance, right? Because there's no unexpected mobilization against the European Union. And the second is, as I explained before, we should see somehow an adjudicating government, that wherever there are claims, demands for informal governance, we should see somebody adjudicating on it, and it should vary with informal governance. So this is what I did in the book, and I'm not going to show you all the evidence there, but the book traces the testable these two testable implications in two consecutive sections. The scope is European Union decision-making from 1959 until today, covers almost all policies except foreign policy and justice and home affairs, which are not necessarily pertinent for this theory. The method I use is what I call a large N qualitative method. It consists of 56 individual mini case studies of decision-making in the various stages of the legislative procedures in various time periods. And I will tell you a little bit more just in the next slides. The data I used is cross-national archival material from German archives, Belgian archives, European Union archives, memoirs, lectures, and a couple of interviews with officials. So to go to the first testable implication. Does this work? Yeah, here it is. So the first testable implication is that informal governance should vary systematically with the propensity of an issue area for domestic shocks, right? And I told you that the common agricultural policy is an area of low domestic, which has a low propensity for domestic shocks, and all other issue areas have a much, much higher propensity. And so this is what I just told you, the large N qualitative case analysis. So we have various stages in the legislative procedures. In the legislative procedure, you see here voting. Then I look at how the parliament behaves. I look at the implementation stage. We have several time periods which are divided by treaty changes, formal treaty changes. And so one individual observation, let's just pick this one. It would be a mini case study on how practices in voting developed in the time period between 1970 and 1986 in areas of high propensity. For instance, in this particular case, I found that there was a reluctance really to vote at all, but this reluctance just, it sort of eased up, and by the time of the Single European Act, which came into force in 1987, governments already voted on a, I wouldn't say on a regular basis because they hardly ever vote, but they voted a little bit more than before. Let's say in about 15% of all cases where they could actually apply voting. So this is just an example for what I did and what these observations are about. But as you can see, there seems to be a system to informal governance. So these dark grayly shaded areas, they are they are practices of informal governance. So where you can really see governments collectively departing from the formal rules, whereas these slightly gray areas, these are areas where I found that the governments stick much, much more to the formal rules in comparison to other issue areas. And you see really it is much more in areas of high propensity for domestic shocks where governments vote and also governments adopt practices of informal governance. And also most of the time, once these practices are adopted, they stick. They don't go away, not even after the treaties have been changed. So this is first evidence for some sort of system, the existence of a norm of informal norm of discretion in areas where there's really a demand for informal discretion. The second piece of evidence is the existence of an adjudicator. I'm not going too much into detail. If you're interested in the theory, it just came out in Review of International Organizations. So look it up in Google Scholar if you're really interested in the Council Presidency. But what I'm trying to find out here is where there's informal governance, is there somebody who adjudicates actually on whether informal governance is legitimate or not? Does it apply? Is it necessary? Or is it not necessary because somebody exaggerates really the domestic pressure they are under? And so I'm saying, well, this government cannot be the government who's actually claiming to be under pressure because this government has an incentive to exaggerate the pressure anyway. Nobody can trust this government. Similarly, a government that has similar preferences, like this government that is demanding informal governance, also cannot be trusted because it actually gains from the accommodation of this particular government. So it has to be somebody who's biased against this view and is really only interested in sustaining the level of integration through informal governance. So what I did in the book in the second part is I found how the Council Presidency actually adopted practices that allowed it to adjudicate in Council negotiation between demands from individual governments to be accommodated, and the other governments that actually have to do the accommodation. Also did a multivariate regression that shows that actually when there's a situation where the presidency has to adjudicate on a topic where it is not biased, so where it would not be able to fulfill this adjudicating function, then these issues are usually dropped from the agenda until the next presidency takes over. And I also did a couple of case studies, but in the interest of time, I'm not gonna bore you with the details and just refer you to the book, which you are going to buy anyway. One that informal governance does not, so departures from formal rules, from the legal norms, does not necessarily undermine the legal norms. They can actually complement them and lead to a higher level of integration than either with formal rules or informal rules alone. It helps make institutions, formal institutions like the European Union or others, it makes them adaptable to changes in its strategic environment, because it helps to accommodate shocks that happen to this institution. And finally, it also has implications for our understanding of the autonomy of international organizations or supranational actors. So through informal governance, the member states collectively have much more control of supranational actors, such as the European Commission, but also if you think of the World Bank, for instance, then the formal rules and often also public commentaries suggest. Now, there are also normative implications. If you think of input legitimacy, then you could say informal governance has sort of counterintuitive implications for our understanding of input legitimacy. So you would normally think, oh my God, things happening behind the scenes, this is bad for democracy, this is bad for legitimacy. But informal governance actually serves to integrate the voices of those domestic actors that are mostly affected by European politics, right? Otherwise, government would simply be outvoted and certain laws simply imposed on an individual government, and therefore individual domestic actors have to bear a lot excessive adjustment costs. But this informal governance actually makes the EU much more responsive to really legitimate interests that have to bear strong, heavy costs from European integration. At the same time, however, informal governance obviously, informal governance obviously makes the European Union pretty opaque. And it's very, very difficult to actually figure out who makes which decisions and why, etc. And in terms of output, you could also say that the EU has far less distributive effects at the domestic level than is often claimed. So let's put it that way. The EU could have much, much more heavy domestic distributive effects. But actually informal governance helps sort of to level out, to even out the excessive domestic distributive effects that domestic actors would actually otherwise bear. So how's this relevant for the Euro crisis? And this is, as said, really where I could use your feedback and expertise. So I've been talking about the EU's daily fare, which is actually preventing excessive conflicts, crises at the domestic level in order to avert that the European Union, the equilibrium, is shook up. But the Euro crisis now is partly caused by an exogenous event, so the financial crisis, and which heavily increased the sovereign debt, and now a couple of European governments are under heavy pressure from the financial markets. And what governments do now is they try to put out the fire, and more or less with success, or well, we will see about that. Well, unfortunately, there's little information available about what is happening behind the scenes, but what is obvious is that there is something happening behind the scene. So what is happening in the euro crisis is really not, cannot be understood without reference to informal governance. As you remember, informal practices in parallel to the formal rules that seem to contradict actually what the treaties say, but actually serve to sustain the European Monetary Union as long as possible for everybody's benefit, or as so far. So one practice of informal governance would be, for instance, the bond buying by the European Central Bank, which is not really covered by the European Central Bank's mandate, right? The mandate is actually to prevent inflation. And you can see that, well, now in a time of crisis, it is necessary just not to care about the formal mandate and actually to do what is necessary behind the scenes in order to sustain the European Monetary Union. Another example would be the bailout, right? Bailout is not permitted by the European treaties. And still you see bailout is going on. The government purchase by the European Central Bank is nothing else but a bailout. Or the European facility, how's it called? The financial stability instrument. Anybody? No. But you can also see there it is not permitted by the formal rules, and still you see governments collectively doing things that are informal, run in parallel to the formal rules in order to sustain the equilibrium that is the European Monetary Union. Well, we don't know how long this is going on. This is going to go on, or how successful it will be. But I believe that this concept of informal governance really helps shed some light on what is happening in the euro crisis and why the euro crisis, or European Union and European Monetary Union, has not collapsed yet, despite this heavy exogenous shock. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
You talked about this adjudicating mechanism, with an adjudicator to talk about informal and formal roles and stuff. And I was thinking, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about Parliament's role and actually expressing, like in the state of test, what can Parliament do for say, with the members of the European Parliament from the state of test, what can they do to bring that the attention to these apple wine producers with the same their attention to council and commission ideas.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I didn't go too much into the theory how the Council Presidency is actually able to gather this information. What happens is that the Council Presidency simply because it has the power to make the decision, does not have to gather the information itself. Simply other actors have an interest in giving the Council Presidency as much information about what is happening at the domestic level as possible. And also in this particular case, you see members of the European Parliament, which in the state of Hesse, well, they are my members of Parliament, they are heavily connected with the apple wine producers. They actually go to the Council Presidency or to the government holding the Council Presidency and tell them actually how heavily this European law would affect the domestic production, and to what extent really these costs are unbearable. And so simply by virtue of having this authority, other actors come to the government holding the presidency and give it the information that it needs in order to make this decision whether actually a claim for informal governance is legitimate or not. I saw a question over there.
With regards to the Eurozone crisis, you mentioned that formal and informal governance working in tandem is an efficient way to do things. Is with their current way that they're dealing with the crisis, it seems more informal or more weighted towards informal governance as opposed to any kind of formal governance? some more formal governance to kind of balance it out?
Well, it is formal and informal in the sense that all the informal is there to support, ultimately retain the credibility of the formal, which is the official commitment to the euro and the credibility actually of the euro as a currency. If it's gonna work in the long run, it really beats me. My suspicion is it's not gonna work. And in a way, you could say it might contradict my theory, which is really about the stability of international organizations. But I shy away in the case of the European Monetary Union because it was an ill-designed institution from the beginning. And so what is now happening is just trying to keep up an institution that eventually has to break down. Even if you fix the European Monetary Union in the short run, in the long run it's just not sustainable. Yeah?
Okay, two questions. So, do you think that over time informal governments tends to become formalized, and should it be, by advocating a body of some sort that is going to work to try to work out these disparate sets of disputes? Would that indicate that you think that we should take what is informally done already by the council president and make a new body? And then the second part of the question is, as completely new institutions are being built, as the EU continues to grow, should they intentionally design into the framework informal government?
Very good questions again. You're right, a couple of those institutions that I described have been formalized in the meantime. For instance, the European Council is now, with the Treaty of Lisbon, a formal institution. What is not formalized is that actually the European Council plays a role in the legislative process. Actually, the treaty says it should not play a role, and it does, right? So this function has, the informal governance function has not been formalized. In the case of the comitology, for instance, it's also been formalized due to judgments of the European Court of Justice, and now also with the previous Treaty of Nice and Treaty of Lisbon. But you see that actually now that the flexibility of this instrument is lost, the governments have found alternative ways actually to implement European law. Now you see European law being implemented by a couple of agencies that are not part of the treaty. They are just, sometimes simply set up by a council decision. And so the moment that actually something is fixed through the treaty, the governments find other way actually to deal with it. And similarly, with the development of other institutions, informal governance is not designed into it. It's more. I wouldn't really say that governments absolutely anticipate the effects, but you.
Space for it, though.
Yeah, you don't really need the space. You just make space for it, right? So in the case of the European Parliament, it was, as you probably all know, it was empowered over time to become a co-legislator. And so you saw a couple of, experiments with how the European Parliament was actually going to behave. And over time, it's simply been implicated into informal governance. But now, even though the European Parliament has the opportunity to go through all stages of the legislative procedure and actually, openly question the Council about its laws, they never do this. They just make informal decisions, agreements with the Council before reaching any further stages. And so most of the laws are just adopted between Parliament and the Council on informal so-called trialogues. So yeah, governments simply find a way. Also, another example would be there have been a couple of laws about how the Council of the EU should actually open up its voting procedures, the Transparency Directive, etc., etc. And so now there's, video recordings of council meetings. There are minutes of council meetings freely available. So what you see now is that most of the decisions are made over lunch. Over lunch, nobody is actually there. There are no translators, no cameras. And so actually, there's a story of a friend of Holger and mine. She's working for the council. And the council, at one point, they were in Luxembourg. They always travel around, like the European Parliament is sometimes there, sometimes there. And so they were supposed to help, as Sherpas, help the ministers take a couple of decisions. But actually, what they did the whole time in Luxembourg was to stand outside of the room, and unfortunately, because the rooms in Luxembourg were under construction, it was simply a bungalow. They were standing outside, kicking the can, just playing silly games, because the ministers were having lunch for 6 hours. Who has lunch for 6 hours? Not even a Frenchman has lunch for 6 hours. So there you go. Governments simply find informal ways all the time. Were more questions? You and then Caitlin?
Well, I was just wondering, towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned that one of the positive implications of informal governance is that it can it helps the EU be more responsive in addition to it becoming a more opaque. And those seem sort of contradictory to me. So I just was wondering how exactly one can also be becoming more opaque, but also becoming more responsive.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of ways how an institution can gain legitimacy, right? If you read Fritz Schaap on the topic, he distinguishes between input and output legitimacy. There's an article by Thomas Risse and I about input throughput and output legitimacy. And so there are various ways to produce it. And so one way to gain legitimacy is to make sure that actually the institution that should be representative of the public will really implements the public will. But according to principal agent analysis and to just knowing from practice, the institution that is supposed to be representative is not always representative, because the public might change its mind, right? It is much more fluid. And this might not be represented and then implemented by the institution itself, in this case the European Union. And so this is an informal mechanism actually to make sure that legitimate interests are really represented in the European Union or in this representative institution in a way that formal rules are simply too stiff to do it, right? They're not responsive enough. But there's a trade-off. That's another way to attain legitimacy, is to make sure that governments are really also accountable for what they are doing, or that citizens actually know what is going on and might deliberate on it, on EU politics. But what you see is that because there's so much informal governance, and because actually informal governance also serves to resolve conflicts that might otherwise create discussion, it serves to, to lower the salience of EU politics, which would be necessary in order to create some sort of public sphere, which could also increase the legitimacy of the European Union. So there's a trade-off, definitely. One here.
Thank you very much. Great talk, and the group, the Master in European Studies group, will talk about the institutions today in class. So this was great, great talk for our group. I have a question about the kind of approach you take, the external shock crisis adjustment model. That whenever there is an external shock, informal governance can serve as a form of adjustment, and it's functional. with the euro crisis, I think the problem is a bit different because, yes, it is an external shock because, what sets off the euro crisis is the global financial crisis. It affects the eurozone. And you have, over the past 2 years, when you analyze, the discourse on the EU level and in the member countries, a sense of there is a pressing urgency, there is kind of a breathless kind of cycle of meetings, and it does not seem to be your regular kind of external shock of such a magnitude that a lot of the functional adaptation hypothesis is actually lost because European leaders really do not know what to do and how they should do it. I mean, we may see something coming out, adjustment, and in fact, the decision made by the European Central Bank yesterday is kind of an adjustment to the crisis. But the past 2 years, I mean, the discourse is really messy, and there are players coming in that didn't really, were not really in your institutional scheme, namely the European Central Bank. Then you have kind of the financial world. You have kind of a real kind of sense of nobody knows, muddling through. Nobody knows what to do really, and then you have very, very different national and sectoral interests. So I'm not exactly sure how your kind of finding about functional adaptation and usefulness of this external shock theory actually holds. It may, 5 years from now, when you look back and we know the results, we may talk about it in this way. But for the past, at least at this point, it's a bit more complex. And of course, we have a question of legitimacy. I mean, we really have an urgent question of legitimacy in the Eurozone crisis with the decisions coming up. And one point I was a bit confused about when you talk about the Council and the decision making taking place in the Council, qualified majority voting, but then you talked about the Presidency. I mean, these are two different institutions, right? I mean, you have the European Council, the meetings of the heads of state, rotating every half year in the time frame that you were investigating. They do not really establish any form of administrative governance. I mean, every half year there's a different presidency. So how can they really work? I mean, it's not a permanent government. The Council of Ministers, however, when you look at the CAP and you look at the agricultural ministers or you look at whatever department is, working on the issue, here you do have a very good professional administration working over a longer period of time with a co-reper and so on. So I'm not exactly sure, how you distinguish between the two. Because I think that the meetings of the heads of state, they can only set kind of the agenda on a very general level. And the day-to-day work, really, of agenda setting, aside from the Commission, of course, and the decision-making takes place in the Council of Ministers, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm quite sure,
let me start, both great questions. Let me start with the last one. I didn't go very much into detail about how the Council Presidency works, but what I would give you as an answer to your question is that the Council Presidency does not need some administrative apparatus in order to fulfill the function as an adjudicator. What it really needs, that was partly also my answer to one of the questions here, what it just needs is the authority to take the decision, to discriminate between legitimate and illegitimate claims for informal governance, and the information that it needs to make the decision really comes from other actors. They have an interest actually to have the Council Presidency make the right decision. And so the Council Presidency for this particular function does not need kind of many offices and experts. It just needs to have the authority in order to gather information that others deliver. Now, the Council Presidency plays many different other functions in the whole system, and for that it needs an apparatus, and also the 6 monthly rotating rotation of the Council Presidency is really not ideal for other functions that the Council Presidency serves, for instance, in external representation, but this does not really concern me. I would also say if the Council Presidency happens to be changed, then there will be an alternative mechanism in order to fulfill this additional adjudicating function that the Council Presidency currently serves. To the other question about functional adaptation, I would completely agree with you. It's only functional adaptation in sort of a narrow sense, Cohanian way, when we can think of these institutions that are supposed to be adapted as efficient. But in the case of the European Monetary Union, it would be a huge stretch to argue that they were efficient to begin with, in an economic but also political economy sense. It was simply from the beginning not an equilibrium, and I must say it's, in retrospect now, really puzzling why the European governments, the European member states in 1993 actually agreed on this design when everybody told them this is just not going to work. But it is still informal governance. It might not be functional adaptation, but it is adaptation in a crisis. It needs, informal governance serves to keep up the equilibrium as long as it is in the member states' interest to actually have this kind of institutions. The moment it serves really its purpose, then they will simply let it collapse. That's my guess of the outcome of the Euro crisis. Students first, so blue shirt, dark shirt.
So would you consider the decision from the ECB on Thursday just on another implementation to maintain the equation? Or if the ECB wouldn't have taken the decision, would you see a collapse of the monetary union coming closer earlier? Or how do you evaluate that?
Yes, I think that it is necessary to, I don't know if everybody is familiar with the decision on Thursday. Maybe you could briefly explain to you.
Basically, the ECB decided that they infinitely are going to buy bonds from the countries in need, or who would need that.
Yeah, exactly. And by buying these government bonds, then decreasing the price of the government, of the interest that governments have to pay for them. And I would say, yeah, it is absolutely necessary to keep the machine running, because the next in line is Italy, Spain, Portugal, and if those government bonds spike, there's really nothing to be done to rescue the Eurozone. And so in the short run, it is in everybody's best interest really to do it. It's not a long-term solution. Or it buys time in order to hopefully do a couple of other reforms that might actually help these governments, member states, get back on their feet. Yeah? Could you speak up, please? Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't look at the foreign policy, for instance, if you mean that, because the foreign policy, I looked at trade policy, which is part of the former European community, but not foreign policy, because the foreign policy is really not as much subject to domestic shocks as in areas that are related to economic integration. But what I could say is the effect in academia, for instance, is that the EU is simply so difficult, or it seems so difficult to understand, and it seems so complex that many, especially Americans, actually shy away from studying it. It's not that the EU is not relevant, right? It's simply, it's a huge investment of time to actually figure it out, to understand how it works. And so you see colleagues of mine doing international political economy, the European Union is absolute relevant for the work, but they say, no, I'm going to study the WTO. This is much more straightforward. And so unfortunately, the European Union is sort of it's a little bit marginalized, not because it's not important, it's hugely important for everyone. It's the world's, most important trading partner. But it's just such a huge investment to understand it. It's become marginalized.
What a great incentive for you to make that investment and shed some light on the security and then tell yourself that you want to understand it a little bit. I was very intrigued by many aspects of your theory, and I was also reminded of another older theory which some of you have heard, you might not have been last year, it's the two-level game theory, which was put forward I think in the 80s or 90s by Robert Putnam. And well, the basic idea is if you are constrained at home, you have a better advantage when negotiating abroad, right? If Maggie Thatcher goes to Brussels and say, my home constituency, the Brits say, so Eurosceptical, we have to get something out, and then they get a rebate, right? And your theory seems to resonate with that, or it's very close. I would like you to explain where your theory is different from that. And beyond that, the difficulty is, of course, when adjudicating legitimate claims of these domestic troublemakers, if you wish, you need some kind of omniscient observer, some guard who says, oh, they are truly upset, and they are just pretending to be upset, they are just complainers because they know if I complain loud enough I will get something. This seems to be a very difficult task, right? The Council Presidency, of course, is a member state. Why is the Council Presidency, who is a member state with its own domestic interests and stuff, why is this actor interested in being an honest broker, a mediator? Of course, it wants to show that it has a successful presidency after 6 months. Right? There are other honest brokers, the Commission has such an interest of that. But okay, two-level games, the difference to you, and how does the adjudicator know whether it's a legitimate clamoring or whether it's a pretended because complainers then get their way?
I think there's perhaps even one answer to both of your questions. And the answer that I would give to your first question first is the difference between two-level games and my theory is that two-level games is a static concept, whereas I'm talking about dynamics, so what happens over time, right? In this two-level concept, you have fixed preferences at the domestic level, and you use this win set in Putnam's terms to actually negotiate or increase your leverage at the international level. But over time, this win set may change, right? So there's uncertainty about the boundaries of this win set. And so you can, of course, use it in order to increase your leverage, and sometimes you also say that your hands are tied, but at the same time, things that happen at the international level might go wrong because the win set in the meantime has changed. And then you need something to adapt the effect of the international level that the international level has on the domestic level in order to keep the whole thing in equilibrium. So it adds uncertainty to the two-level game, which is what Putnam did not do. To your second question, how does the presidency then know what is a legitimate reason and what is not a legitimate reason? It has to figure it out on the spot because it's uncertain, right? You cannot say in advance what will be in the future a legitimate reason actually to be accommodated or to demand informal governance. It is impossible to predict, right? But you need some some flexibility mechanism in order to cope with those things in the world that are simply unpredictable. And so what the presidency does is it figures it out on its feet, right? It figures out, well, does the government really, is the government really going to defect or not comply with the laws as it maintains? And if this happens, is it really so bad for our institutions that we will have to accommodate it? And so sometimes you see that governments, the presidency decides, well, who cares? We will just have this imposed onto, let's say, Luxembourg, and eventually it is going to comply. And maybe 5 years later it would have made a different decision because the domestic, the situation simply has changed. But what the presidency does is simply it weighs the damage to the commitment that would come from a defection of an individual government versus what is necessary to accommodate the concessions to be made to this particular government, and then decides whether it is actually informal governance is pertinent. Another one here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's an excellent question. So basically, it's the question of power, right? I talk a little bit about it in the chapters that I sent to you. I would say yes, power does matter. So if you think about Malta saying it really has domestic problems with a certain EU law versus Germany saying it has huge problem actually explaining a certain EU law to its citizens, it does matter. If Germany does not comply with EU law, then it questions really the credibility of the EU as such. If Malta doesn't do it, but Germany does, it doesn't really matter so much. So yeah, there is an element of power in that governments whose defection or non-compliance could really damage the commitment of the European Union or the formal rules, then it is much more likely that this government is going to actually receive concessions through informal governance.
Yes, I had a question regarding institutions that are formalized in the EU through various treaties, and basically they might have the role of writing an opinion, but the opinion is never read, more or less. But that institution is not there for it's not there for no reason whatsoever. So is it technically an informal institution then, as opposed to a formal way of governing? And is there a way that you can categorize each individual, a delegation, a committee, whatever it may be, as formal or informal, based on its actual output, necessarily what its input is supposed to be?
Could you give an example of such a...
Like the Economic and Social Committee, Committee of Regions, things of that nature. How, I mean, more or less they're formalized, but their opinion really doesn't mean much, and their power is not significant. So it's kind of informal in nature. Is there a way to categorize that?
Well, I wouldn't, according to my definition, I wouldn't call it informal. So formal for me is everything that is in the treaty, in the primary law of the European Union. And so the Economic and Social Council, the Committee of Regions, etc., they would officially call, in my view, be formal institutions. But in my humble opinion, they simply don't matter, really, at all. And in addition, they are not really relevant for what I'm trying to explain because they don't serve the function of a commitment. So they are not really instrumental in being able to impose certain outcomes on an individual government, and so therefore sort of clutter, right? But yeah, great question regarding to the definition of what is actually formal governance and what is informal. I could have made this more explicit, probably. Thanks. Again?
With your permission.
Go ahead.
It shows the common agricultural policy as the example of what is a low propensity for domestic shock. I'm not a specialist on the policy, but my childhood memories of the European Union were farmers taking to the streets in Brussels, and not only there, but also in various other countries. The French reacting violently to Spain becoming a member of the European Union in the agricultural competition. So, just on the face of it, it seems agriculture seems to have stirred lots of domestic shock, and even the case you chose as a prime example falls into the common agricultural policy, right? Defining an agricultural product, wine, apple wine, or whatever domestic term you use for that. So I was wondering whether how do you justify saying CAP is uncontentious, not really susceptible to these kind of domestic shocks, especially also under collective action theory. We would define a small group that stands to gain or lose a lot from government decisions. Like the small group, the 2% of farmers in the EU stand to gain a lot or lose from these decisions. They are very effective lobbyists. But from that, if you give these kind of lobbyists a special voice and call it input legitimacy,
well, it is absolutely true that there's huge domestic mobilization of farmers all across Europe. It is absolutely true that the common agricultural policy creates a lot of conflicts, but those are not shocks. You can set your time to the demonstration of farmers in Brussels. It is absolutely predictable at what point in time and to what extent the farmers are going to demonstrate against the European Union. And this was known already every time when the Common Agricultural Policy was designed. It is known when certain EU laws that apply to the Common Agricultural Policy are proposed by the European Commission. And because it is in the extent absolutely predictable, then there's no real need for flexibility, because you simply design the institutions and the secondary law in a way that actually you can cope with the extent of this domestic farmers' protest. It is true that this one example might be pertinent for the agricultural policy. It was partly part of the a common agricultural policy that then decided in a different council. So it's pretty difficult to actually say what it belongs to. But yeah, no, you're right. No. Yeah, no, absolutely true. There are a couple of EU laws that are similar to what is happening in the single market, and that they are actually creating a common integrated market for these products. But this is not what is happening in like 90%, 80% of the common agricultural policy, which is about the definition of milk quotas, about the level set for farm subsidies, about tariffs vis-a-vis third actors, etc., etc. So this is not the bulk of what the European Union does, or the common agricultural policy.
Thank you very much, Professor Kleine. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you.
And thanks to you all for having such great questions. And this is just a quick reminder, particularly for those of you who are not TAM students, that we have another lecture today at 3:30. The Irish ambassador will be speaking in the Nelson Mandela Auditorium today. So please stop by and join us.
thank you very much for listening.